and welcome back for another episode on the Unfiltered Healing Podcast. In today's episode, we dig into some deep history. My guest, Dr. Michael Lebowitz, has experience and knowledge basically just uncovering into biblical times some of the ailments and things that they were exposed to and bringing it into modern science, how there may be a correlation and success with what they did, and also the reason behind those things. So it's a very fun episode we have for you guys today. We talk a lot about different infections, specifically mold infections, and how those were given examples of in Moses' time, but also currently how it's just such a big problem for so many people. Really a hidden problem, but it's definitely become more publicized as far as the research we have on it and how it affects the health of your body. So we give a lot of different tips in this episode to help mitigate some of those effects of mold and correlating it back then, what they did and what we do now. And it's just so fascinating. So Dr. Michael Lebowitz, he's a legend in our chiropractic profession. He's been practicing for a very long time. He's also a master kinesiologist, and he developed the supplement line by Supreme Nutrition Products, which is one that I use a lot for my patients just because their quality of their herbs are just really unmatched. They're so pure, and they're still a family-owned business. He worked for another supplement company before that who sold out to a big business and lost basically their quality and what they were doing. And that's just what we see with a lot of supplement companies now. It's really hard to find good quality, pure things that aren't just about the money. So anyways, he's written a ton of publications, written a ton of books. And so I will give information and links to all of that so you can keep in touch with what they're doing in their practice and helping people mitigate some things that we're exposed to and consistently will be exposed to new things. So I hope you enjoy today's episode. To remind you again, please like, comment, share these episodes either on iTunes or YouTube specifically so that people can find these, so that they can learn, so that they can feel empowered, and so that they can also spread that to more people. So if you haven't shared this podcast, just wanted to remind you again, please go and do it. The more that you share, the more that you like, the more people can see them, and they're brought into the algorithm for them to be able to see that. So we love you guys. Thank you for all your support, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
What do you do to take care of yourself?
Welcome to the Unfiltered Healing Podcast with Dr. Rachel Hamill.
I ain't Dr. Phil. I'll truly help you heal your mind.
Connect with alternative medicine innovators that will challenge and empower you.
It has the potential to change your whole life.
Create natural balance for both your body and mind.
Your health is very important.
All while uncovering the truth behind modern medicine.
This is crucial.
It's raw, it's real, and it's unfiltered. Here's your host, Dr. Rachel.
All right. Well, Dr. Lebowitz, hopefully I pronounced that correctly. It is such a pleasure. Welcome to the Unfiltered Healing Podcast.
I was very happy to be here.
Well, we don't personally know each other. I have met your son, Noah, at a conference a few years back. And I've also used, your supplement line in my practice for many years now. But I love that we get to have these types of conversations and these types of podcasts and just talk about the deep history of ailments from a different perspective. So I'm really excited for our conversation today and what it will open up and bring to people. But before we jump into today's topic, can you share with the audience a little bit just about yourself, what got you into alternative medicine, and kind of where you are now currently?
I've been involved in some form of alternative medicine probably since the early 1970s. I used to help run a food co-op where we had, healthy whole foods that we made available to the community. This was in Buffalo, New York, before I ever went to chiropractic school. And I started reading about every health book there was back then. And these were a lot. I developed a library that probably went back to the 1700s on natural health books, and had all these books by people who are like Sylvester Graham, who invented the graham cracker, and John Harvey Kellogg, who eventually became Kellogg's, but it used to be a health food brand back then. And so I used to read all of those things and got very into it. I had my own health problems. Since I was small, I had lots of allergies, migraines, other things like that. I was always looking for natural ways to help those things. And so eventually led me into chiropractic school. Before chiropractic school, I had taken some courses in Touch for Health, and I realized that applied kinesiology was what I wanted to go into. So chiropractic school was a vehicle to be able to practice that. And ever since then, it's been kind of a search because I'm a real perfectionist. I really want to get everyone better as quickly as possible. And so I'm always looking for new ways to do that.
So, when you were starting and searching for all these natural remedies and things of that nature, did you necessarily grow up with that in your home, or was this like a very new realm that you were just interested in and felt pulled to go that direction?
No, I grew up in a home that was pretty much a typical American diet. And I also had lots of food addictions. There were certain foods that I just couldn't stop eating, especially sweets. And I would go on binges, and I went through, I guess, what you might call eating disorders at times. Just so the interest didn't really start until the end of college when I got into fasting. I started actually to just lose weight, but it started then, and I started researching and reading, and it was kind of a secular way of looking for, almost like looking for eternal life through diet. Looking back, it's pretty silly, but yeah, I was thinking if I had the right diet, maybe I could live forever. And there were lots of books that supported that type of viewpoint, which I definitely don't believe in anymore. But as a naive 20-year-old, it was very appealing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of us have had those moments of vanity where then we recognize, oh, okay, yeah, there's much more than that. There's much more that goes into that. So, we appreciate honesty and humility. That's what gets us where we are. And typically, a lot of us in this field, we've had our own health journeys that have got us to this point. So, okay, so you're in college and you're beginning fasting and doing all of these things and you're noticing some changes. And then what was kind of then the development from there into then, wanting to be a chiropractor or that history?
Well, I guess since I'll be totally transparent in this interview, I never really wanted to be a chiropractor. What happened was I had graduated, and I decided that I wanted to, again, pursue this whole dietary thing. And so I moved to Hawaii, and I bought an acre of land, and I was going to just grow all my own food. And that didn't work out very well. The acre of land didn't have much soil because of volcanoes. That was all I could afford. And it just wasn't working. And I came back to the mainland, and I was working in another food co-op, and I had I had been married back then just for a very short time, and it's way too long to get into, but it didn't work out. I was still very secular at that point, and I was very depressed. And my parents came out and visited, and they said, "Well, what do you want to do with your life?" And I said, I really want to be a naturopath because I wanted to work with diet and different things. And naturopathy back then wasn't very well accepted. I think there were 8 states that you could practice. And my parents said, well, if you become a chiropractor, we'll pay for your schooling, but we won't pay for a naturopathic. And I had never been to a chiropractor. They had never been to a chiropractor. So I'm not sure where that came from with them. And I said, sure. And so I was living in Portland, Oregon. There was a chiropractic school in Portland, Oregon. So I applied and, and again, I had the idea of practicing more applied kinesiology and dietary and nutritional things. But I did it via being a chiropractor.
Yeah, that's not something typically you hear for people to go and be a chiropractor. It's usually kind of the opposite. But I'm very similar. Like, I never had this crazy chiropractic story or wanted to be a chiropractor either. What got me into alternative medicine was through nutrition as well. But I love the fact that, it's just an umbrella. You can do so many things and, really expand on that. So very similar. Okay, so then once you moved back from Hawaii and we're doing the co-op and this thing again, then how did you start to get into, because I know you have a history as well of working with supplement companies, and then you currently have your own supplement line as well. So was there, what was kind of the history of that venture?
Well, after I graduated chiropractic school, I moved back to Hawaii and I was practicing there. After I got really sick in Hawaii, and looking back at it, I didn't realize exactly why then, but we were living in a cabin on 80 acres of macadamia nuts and various fruits, and it was a beautiful place. But like, one day I went and opened up the closet and my shoes had turned green, and basically from the mold. But I didn't put this together because no one really talked about mold back then other than it might cause you to sneeze. And I was getting really bad migraines and chronic fatigue and other things like that. And also, with my parents getting over and my wife's parents getting older, we decided to move to the mainland. And so we moved back, and I took my first official applied kinesiology courses when I got back. Dr. George Goodhart and Dr. Wally Schmidt were teaching. And during this seminar, they said, is there anyone who has chronic fatigue and headaches and so forth who wants to come up, for a demonstration? And I raised my hand and I went up, and Dr. Schmidt found something called kinin-mediated allergies on me, which is basically a type of inflammatory reaction to various foods. And he said, you have this. And I said, well, what do I do about it? And he said, well, I haven't figured that out yet. Try some zinc. And I took a little bit of zinc, and I had a remission for about 6 months from my symptoms, which was pretty amazing. And then they came back, and I started researching, and I was reading books, and I was reading books by a medical doctor named Sherry Rogers, who wrote about environmental exposures and health and molds and health, and all these other doctors in environmental medicine. And so I was taking what I was reading and trying to put it with our kinesiological method of diagnosis. As chiropractors, it was just a much better way. And I was finding different things. I was sharing with Dr. Schmidt about these, and he started doing them. And then he eventually invited me to teach with him. So we went around, we were teaching together about molds, about foods. This was the late 80s. And I went to an American Academy of Environmental Medicine meeting. They wouldn't let us in as doctors, so we had to go in as lay people, since they'd never had any chiropractors there before. And there was a booth there in their vendor section of a vitamin company. And I was just visiting the booths. And when I went up to this booth, the guy said, well, our vitamins are better than everybody else's. And I said, why? And he said, well, we don't put any fillers or binders or excipients in, so they're just going to be a lot cleaner. And it was the end of the conference. He said, well, why don't you take all of my stuff? I don't want to haul it back. And he gave me like 50 different bottles of vitamins. And so I took them back and I was testing them, and I realized that they did test more frequently than other brands, that there was something better about them. And some of my sensitive patients, including myself, were able to tolerate them. And so we started using them. I started teaching solo at that point, and a lot of doctors were reporting that they were getting really good results. So we were very happy doing that. And the company one day just came to me and said, hey, we've gotten so much business because of you. We're going to give you a commission. So they gave me a commission. And I said, well, I'll only take a commission if I don't have to recommend the products of yours that I don't believe in. And they said, yeah, that's fine. That's no problem. And this stayed for, I don't know, probably 15 years or something. I was writing a monthly newsletter, which I still write, which is free, on various case histories and different observations. And after that, like most supplement companies, unfortunately, it got bought out by venture capitalists. If you look at a lot of supplement companies now, a lot of them are owned by big businesses. Nestle owns a lot of them. Pfizer actually owns a couple of them. And so they got bought out, and their direction changed, because they used to be a very family-based kind of perfectionist company making the purest things. And once the venture capitalists took over, the direction just seemed a little bit different. And so I wanted, oh, I know what happened. So we went to Kauai on vacation one year, and what happened was I was going to visit my friend Mike, and because he called me up and he said, hey, I need work in my taro field and I can't find any workers. I said, okay, I'll come. So my wife drops me off at his taro field, and he looks at me and he says, well, I didn't tell you that if you work in a taro field, you're going to get leptospirosis, because all of our taro fields are flooded in water, and the water is filled with leptospirosis. And he said, I won't get it because I've had it already. I'm immune. And he also said there are these snails that are so sharp that if you step on them, it'll probably cut your toe off. And my wife had already left, so I couldn't say, okay, sorry, I'll leave. And I had been eating some dried noni fruit that I had found in the health food store. Whenever I'd go to the health food store back then, if I found anything that was weird, I would buy it. And so I was eating it. And after working the day in a taro field and a couple of days went by, he called me up and he said that he had leptospirosis. He didn't think he'd get it again. And I didn't. And I thought, well, maybe it was the noni fruit that I was eating. And so when we got back home, we were experimenting, because noni was getting big in terms of the juice and stuff. And we found that didn't really work. But when we got some dried noni fruit and gave it to some patients who were going to different places that they typically in the past would get fungal infections because they were humid and tropical and so forth, if they were eating this dried noni fruit and they didn't get the fungal infections. And since I wasn't really working much with Thorn, well, anymore, I called a friend of mine and I said, hey, maybe we can put out noni as a supplement that would be, in a capsule. And dried noni fruit leather isn't the most, it's an acquired taste, let's put it that way. And so we put it out, and we were able to do it without adding any fillers or binders or anything, because a lot of those things stop absorption, or they have negative effects, or like, for instance, if stearic acid is found in a product, or magnesium stearate, it's often a derivative of GMO cottonseed oil, even though it doesn't tell you that on the label. So we came out with that. Slowly, as different things happened, it's hard to, like, the next product we came out with was Bodyguard. And the reason was we were just learning about electromagnetic sensitivity. And we didn't know, we wanted to see if there was a supplement that would help your body resist some of the negative effects. And we just had all these herbs in our office and we just started testing them. And we found this one that worked really well. It wasn't the one I expected. And then after that, every once in a while, we'd come out with a new supplement. Sometimes it was like totally God inspired. Like, it would just be like, it would just fall in our lap in some almost supernatural way. And other times it was more just of our academic searching and our kinesiologic testing to find what would work. And, it just slowly grew. I mean, I'm not a business person. I have a very busy practice, but it's never been a super lucrative practice because I spend too much time with my patients and I charge too little on my patients. But and again, I didn't want to run a supplement company, but I couldn't find a group of people that were going to meet the quality standards that we had and that would allow me through clinical testing to decide what batch, like let's say we wanted to put out another noni batch, we would get 4 or 5 different batches and I would test them and I would blind test them. I wouldn't know the cost or anything else. And I'd say, this is the one that tests the best. And they would buy that one and use that. To find a company who would be willing to do that, I couldn't. So we started it. I never had ownership in the company, but a friend of mine just started it. So, and it just kind of grew. And it's not like it's so big, but we've always tried to keep those standards. Because again, the goal was to make things that were going to fill a niche in the market and help doctors help their patients and also not compromise, because we had, we were never going to sell out or do any of those things that so many people, because people now sell, some of their companies, people we know, for like, $120 million. I mean, it's like, what am I going to do with $120 million other than give it away?
Yeah, it's sometimes you just can't escape like the need to be filled, And I think that's where oftentimes we'll find ourselves is like, and it's getting harder and harder. Supplements are being bought out more and more, and they're not regulated. And there's a million in the store, like even conventional stores now. And so a lot of them are synthetic and can be more toxic than not. So, we really value your authenticity and keeping that and maintaining that as just starting as your own family-based business and practice, but now expanding that so other practices and
And
families.
it's got a lot worse, because most vitamins are made in factories overseas, typically in China. And it used to be that they came from coal tar, which isn't great. Now they come from GMO, so genetically modified bacteria and fungi. So they're kind of like a frankincense excretion product, Frankenstein excretion product. So, it's a little bit scary because, again, like you said, it's unregulated and they can serve a very good purpose short term. But, if something makes you feel better, it doesn't always mean it's good for you. I mean, some people eat junk food and it makes them feel better. If I did cocaine, it could make me feel better. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. Well, I could spend more time on talking about your supplement company because it's very interesting, but I'm going to segue out of that and talk a little bit about, on top of creating this company and having that and all of your other accolades, you've also, published lots of research studies and you've written a few books. And one of those that we're going to kind of dig into a little bit today is called God's Preventative Medicine. Now, what kind of sparked the writing of that book particularly, and how did that kind of come into play for you?
Okay, so I've been teaching a class. It's basically a Torah study. So we take Genesis through Deuteronomy, and it's broken up into weekly portions. And every week we study. And we've been doing that for probably at least 15 years. maybe where I've been leading it. I mean, it's been going on for longer. And right now it's on Zoom. It used to be an in-person thing. And so, each time you can read the Bible, an infinite number of times, and each time you can get something different out of it, something deeper from it. And so I was always interested in the part in Leviticus where they talked about, they use the word leprosy in English, which unfortunately is not a good translation, but they talked about different skin afflictions and different afflictions that would affect your house and your clothing. And when you read it, if you knew anything about mold and fungus, you knew that's what they were talking about. So whenever we got to that part in our study every year, I would kind of bring this up, and no one had ever looked at it that way. Everybody tried to allegoricalize it and say, well, it didn't really talk about actual growth. It meant something else. And so I was finding different things like that. And I was teaching the class, and someone said, well, you should write a book about this. And I said, no, I don't want to really do that. I'd written 2 books before that, I think, but I just didn't want to write another book, because oftentimes by the time you write a book, you've found out more stuff and the book becomes almost obsolete. And so I was just kind of in rebellion against writing this book. And so one day I was crossing the street, and I was texting when I was crossing the street, which I would never recommend. And I ended up tripping in this hole, and I shattered my knee into 18 pieces. And so, after having surgery and so forth, I was at home, not able to do anything. And it was like, I thought, well, this is the time to write the book. I mean, hopefully God didn't make me break my knee so I would write the book. I always wonder about that, but
He
I'm
might have
very
just allowed it.
thankful in the long run. Yeah. So, when you look at different things in the Bible, if you look at, like, for instance, if you look at the first 5 books of the Bible, there are a lot of commandments there. There's the 10 commandments, and there's all these other commandments. And in present day Judaism, they divide the commandments into 3 different groups. One group are the ones that are involved in holidays, like here's how you do Passover. One group is more like the things you need for society to run well. Don't steal, don't murder, don't commit adultery, and so forth. And the third group is ones that at this point in time, they just don't know why they exist. You can come up with theories like, why shouldn't you mix wool and linen in a piece of clothing? Or, is it just a test? Like when God said, don't eat from this tree, is he just testing your obedience? Or was there some physiologic reason behind it? And so it was almost like God started giving me some revelation about certain things. And I started reading, and I found that there were different things that science could explain now that it couldn't explain back then. And because oftentimes, a lot of the Bible scholars aren't also scientists, they might not be aware of certain things that have been discovered that fit perfectly. Like there's a section in the book, I think we might have called the chapter, "Is God Sexist?" Because when you read the Bible, some present day secular person might say, well, God really favors men. But when you read it and the development of different things, and physiology and other things, that that God loves everyone equally, and he actually had a lot of things that were very protective for women. That compared to what was going on in that time period, it was just revolutionary. And so one of the things was, I think it's chapter 12 in Leviticus, God says that, if a woman has a female child, they have to stay away from the temple. When you add up the 2 time periods, like 80 days. But if she has a male child, only 40 days. So you think, well, God must not like female children or something like that. And when I started doing research, there's, men have XY chromosomes and women have XX chromosomes. So if a woman has, they found if a woman has male child, some of the Y chromosomes end up being left in the woman's bloodstream for a period of time. And when the child's no longer there, the woman's body recognizes those Y chromosomes as kind of like a foreign invader and ramps up the immune system to try to deal with them. So as a result, the woman her immune system recovers a little bit quicker from the whole physiologic stress of giving birth if she has a male child than a female child. It's just a physiologic norm that happens. So as a result, she would have been able to re-enter the temple quicker because her immune system would have recovered quicker. And so, but if you didn't know that, you looked at it, it just wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah. And I think that's,
There's a lot of different things.
I was just going to say, I think that's why a lot of people kind of skip over that book because they're like, things just seem so strange. Like, I don't understand why they would do these things. And so you always need revelation of the timing and what's happening, but also what you're talking about, how we have even more modern science now to even explain some of these things. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that was known, I don't think I wrote about it, I might have, but like look at circumcision. And you can argue the pros and cons, which we're not going to do. But if you look at circumcision, the day that the baby has the highest fibrinogen levels, so it'll have the best ability to clot, is the 8th day. And that's the day that God commanded Jewish people to circumcise so that the baby wouldn't just, have uncontrolled bleeding from the procedure. There are different things like that, it's kind of like if you had parents and you're a little child and your parents say, well, don't do that and don't do this and so forth, you might not have any clue why. Hopefully you love them and you don't have too much of a rebellious spirit and you just obey them. And you have to look at God as this loving parent that gives lots of instructions for our good, whether we understand them or not.
But wow, that's so fascinating. Now, I know specifically you hit on it a little bit already, but I'd love to talk a little bit more in depth as well, because one of the big, I guess, topics that's coming up more and more is the mold component of things. So, fungal infections and even candida and just toxicity. And you're right, like a while ago, they didn't know what to do with it or they didn't. And we're finding more modern science research that shows all of the health implications of it. But as you are giving examples of, this is not something that is new, a new finding. It's been something that has been tracked back for a long time. So can you dig into a little bit of what you found through your research biblically as well, correlating that together?
What's interesting is I got very sick from mold. And the reason I did was I was collecting all of these old natural health books. And I was also collecting books on eschatology, so on kind of end time things. And so I had about 2,000 books that went back as far as the 1600s. Like people like Isaac Newton wrote books on eschatology. And I had the original copies of those type of things. And so that was in my treatment room. And so I had like 2,000 moldy books in my treatment room. So I was breathing them in all the time and I got really, really sick and I didn't have enough energy to work past like 11 a.m. When I started doing research into some of the current doctors, like Dr. Sherry Rogers, for instance, and thought about molds, and Candida was getting very popular. And Dr. Schmidt and I were teaching ways to discern if people had it and how to treat it. But I thought, well, there's all these airborne molds, especially in certain homes and other things like that. And since molds love warm, wet, dark environments, since your body is warm, wet, and dark, it's a perfect place for it. And so we thought that, well, there's probably a lot of other funguses and molds that can live in people's bodies besides just Candida. And we started testing and found that that's true. In fact, these days we're doing some experiments where we're having people basically spit into mold plates and we're seeing what grows. And we're showing it to the patients after 6 days what grew in their mold plate. If you saw it, you'd probably never kiss anyone the rest of your life. But it's it's pretty interesting how many molds we store inside our body. And so we started finding that, and we started finding that, a lot of people would get, when I take case histories, I don't use real forms, I just ask questions. And a lot of times when you say, well, when did you get sick? And they say, well, it was, 1993. And you say, what happened that year? And they go, well, I moved. So they moved from one house to another. And if that house had, some type of problem, and again, most people are unaware of those problems, especially back then, that it could have come from their house. Or another thing that would get people, symptomatic, they say, well, I was good. And I say, well, what did happen back then? They say, well, I changed relationships. I broke off with this person, started seeing this person. And a kiss can pass like something like 10 million bacteria and numerable funguses too. So you might contract something. It is an STD in a sense, but it's not like one of the deadly, it's not like you're getting syphilis or herpes or something like that. You're passing some fungus and you're giving it a new breeding ground that it's taking advantage of.
Same with parasites and bacteria. Same ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what did they do? So the history of that, what did they do back in the day to help
So, yeah, if you look back, well, it's interesting because you had priests back then, and the priests, in Hebrew, the word is kohen. And it's interesting because in Hawaii, the name for the native healers is kahuna, which is basically the same word. So you wonder, if the Hawaiians had a biblical basis for their naming and so forth. And what they used to do is they would come in and diagnose. They would, they would look and see, and then they'd recheck like a week later. And depending on what happened, like if it was on a person's skin, the first thing they would do was quarantine the person. So it accomplished two things. They would take him outside of the camp. So basically, they'd put him in a new environment. So the exposure was different. And also, they would take him away from all the people that they could transmit it to. And they would stay there for a number of days. And this was back during the Exodus. So they were in the wilderness. Their diet was perfect. It was just manna. They weren't eating any junk food. It was just, so like now we have to put people on a diet to help with fungus eradication, but you didn't have to back then because they were on the perfect diet. So you put them, somewhere else. And what's interesting is, one of the drivers of funguses growing is basically stress, because what happens is when you're under stress, your immune system decreases its ability to engulf different organisms. And so the Bible gives people lots of time for introspection. A lot of the holidays like Passover, you're supposed to take the leaven out of your house. And if leaven represents sin, you go through this whole introspection, as you're going through the house, and, anything in a sense sinful, we would go through and say, hey, is this book really uplifting for me to own? Or is this television show really, a God, affirming type of thing to do? And so suddenly, you're outside of your community, you're outside of your camp, you're alone in quarantine. Ideally, you're going to use that time for introspection, and hopefully there'll be some prayer and some revelation, and as a result, some decrease in stress. So you're away, you're out of your environment, you're decreased stress, and then they would examine you again. If it seemed like you were improved, you would be exposed to different herbs, different essential oils, and so forth in the cleansing process. And that would probably wipe out the rest of it, because a lot of herbs that they would use back then, like frankincense and myrrh and cinnamon, they're antifungal, they're antibacterial. And in the Bible, it says the leaves are for the healing of the nations, which you could look at as some type of herbal affirming statement. And so then, then they would be allowed back in, assuming that there was resolution from all that. And the same thing, the priests, if you look at the priests had a dirty job, because you think of them just, they're praying and they're doing this. But back in those days, they were basically butchers, so their job was slaughtering animals. And on some holidays, they could slaughter like, tens of thousands of animals a day. And you think about, they did some things like, okay, they couldn't slaughter animals that had blemishes because that would up their chances that they had some type of disease. But you can't just diagnose disease by looking at an animal. So they were probably exposed to all types of microbes. So one thing that, you had incense burning in the temple, and incense like cinnamon and some of the others, again, they're very antifungal, they're antibacterial. So it would keep the bacterial count down. They would anoint the priests with essential oils on their earlobes and their thumb pads and their toe pads, because those were the most extreme parts of the body. So if they put it there, it could go and cover all of the body, therapeutically. So they would do that. They put incense in the bread. Well, they put frankincense in the bread that the priests ate. And again, frankincense is a great antimicrobial. So God set up all of these different rules to keep the priests healthy, and also to keep the people that got sick, to make them, well again.
What is it about those different areas that you found? Is there like just an increased absorption in those areas of the body using, essential oils there, or was there specifically another?
Well, it was interesting when I read about it. First I thought, well, it's as far out on the body as you can get. Your hands, your feet, your earlobes, pretty much. And so I think that since the veins and so forth, and the lymph system kind of brings it toward the center, once that it would cover it. But when I read about it, I thought, this sounds kind of hokey, and we started testing different essential oils, both ones that were biblical and ones that were also found in recent science to break down biofilms, which are protective houses that bacteria and fungus make to protect it from your immune system. And so what we did was we took some people who had these problems, and so did some friends of ours, and we just said, okay, we're going to apply them to these spots, just like it says in the Bible. We don't have any expectations that anything good is going to happen. And as a result, we found, like one of my colleagues said, well, I have this person and he's had a prostate infection for 20 years. And I did what you said and suddenly it's gone. And I'm not saying it does that in everybody for sure, but we got a lot of anecdotal reports, and we thought, well, God must know what he was saying. I mean, we kind of knew that anyway, but it was nice to have like visible, audible confirmation of that.
Yeah, that's super fascinating because, you don't really even hear that in all these essential oil brands and things that you can get as well. It's just like, you can put it anywhere. But there's even a method to that as far as getting it to where it needs to go and doing what it needs to do. And biofilms are a big part of what make pathogens very tricky to eliminate from the body.
And you have to be really careful. I ended up in the hospital once because what happened was I had an infection that almost killed me about 15 years ago. And I ended up getting over it, I thought. And I was starting to take some enzymes a few years later for a different problem. And what happened was the enzymes broke down the biofilms, and I still had that organism in me, but they were stuck in biofilms. And basically, when I took the enzymes, it broke down the biofilms. It was kind of like opening up Pandora's box. And I ended up with a relapse of the sickness and ended up back in the hospital again. And when God made these essential oils for it, the essential oils not only break down the biofilm, but they kill what's inside the biofilm. So they cover both bases. So it's a much more natural, whole type of thing than just man's development of like enzymes to do those kind of things.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I knew that about essential oils as well, but many people probably don't know that, specifically, even if they know about biofilms, that they kind of do both things depending on what you're using. So that's a great tip for people to take away for mold and issues of that nature. So, okay, going back a little bit again. So when these types of, and you correlated it in, I think your research, you said like the meaning of the words of leprosy and those different types of things. They would segregate them, do those things. And then what specifically would they do with the home? Because that would primarily be the cause of it on top of stress. What would they do in those situations?
Unfortunately, well, fortunately or unfortunately, again, they would kind of give it so much time and see if it would resolve. And if it didn't, they would dismantle the home and take all the material and take it outside the community, which would probably be a good idea for a lot of homes now. But I don't think the insurance companies would reimburse people if they did that. I mean, sometimes you can remediate mold in homes and sometimes you can't. I mean, there are some people that have to move to get better. And some of the remediation is good, some is toxic, you know?
It definitely depends on who's doing it and their knowledge and experience. But also, I agree with you, like the way that homes are built now with the materials that they're made of and improper ventilation and all of these things, it just seems like mold is such a huge problem in so many homes now. It seems almost inescapable to a sense. So having some of these practices and knowledge of these things can also be very helpful. Now, you personally struggled with some fungal mold issues, and then you also have, a lot of just knowledge and research on fungal. What are some other types of like ailments or infections you also found while researching? Because you talked about them being the priests being butchers and other types of infections. Were there any other types of things that you found in your research as well that gave?
Well, I think first, you should understand the possible symptoms of fungal issues, which basically can be anything. I mean, the most common things are probably fatigue, brain fog, mood swings. Not everybody has them, but those are the most common. And then the rest depends on where the fungus is residing. It can cause major lung issues. I've never seen it asthmatic where fungus wasn't at least a component of it. It could be in your gastrointestinal tract and you have bloating. Funguses are like having Monsanto live inside your body because funguses produce benzene and they produce acetaldehyde, which is in the same family as formaldehyde. So you have this little toxic chemical factory in your body producing things. So as a result, your liver gets overloaded. If your liver gets overloaded, you might have PMS, you might have something else. So basically, then there are all the dermatological things that they talked about in the Bible and so forth that might have a fungal component, So, and it's really interesting. If I get a fungal infection, I get migraines. If my son Josiah gets a fungal infection, he loses his ability to do math or play the piano well. Everybody's affected differently. My other son gets a little bit of skin stuff, and that's pretty much what he gets. And some people can be carriers. Some people, it's not only having it grow in your body, it's a matter of how sensitive you are to it. So two people can have it, and one person can have zero symptoms, kind of like they talk about typhoid Mary. And, the other person might be disabled from it. I mean, we had one person, probably the worst case we ever had was a woman who was living in a moldy house, and she might have had some other issues on top of it, but in the end, she ended up in a wheelchair, and her husband ended up being disabled from it too. It's been hard, like when personally, if we've moved a lot, and when I'm looking at a house, the first question is, can I smell any mold? I open up every cabinet. I go in the corners of every closet and I just sniff, which is not good for me. But in the long run, it is, because it would take us away from certain houses. Or we would take air samples and check, because some people might be fine in there for a little while, but under certain stresses or under certain negative food influences and so forth, it could take hold. And so much after, like I moved into the house 2 years ago, it might, in some stronger people, take 2 years before it breaks their system down. So it's a real challenge, like you said, these days, because of building methods and so forth. If you have air conditioning, the air conditioning can get contaminated very easily, and you're just blowing mold throughout the house. Certain parts of the country are definitely worse than others, but even when I practiced in Scottsdale, Arizona, there was a decent percentage of homes that had mold issues, even though it was in the middle of the desert.
Yeah, you probably have those genetic variations that deal with mold, because I find that in all the people that I screen, they have like a super smeller for mold. Like they can just go in
Mhm.
a place and be like, "Yep, there's mold in here," and within like a couple of seconds, and they're just like, "Wow!" Like they just are super heightened to those things. So it can almost
I always look at that as being a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because you're getting warning signs, so you're not going to end up in it. But it's a curse in a sense, just because it makes life a little bit more difficult and challenging at least on a superficial level.
totally, yeah. So knowing this, we never want to create fear in people and have them like fear living in their home or purchasing or anything like that. That's never our intention of bringing knowledge. So, what are some tips before we move on from mold a little bit? What are some tips specifically that you could share about some of these infections for people?
Well, definitely the less refined sweetening you're going to eat, the less you'll be feeding it. And it's interesting, if you look at diets of people who Western diets haven't been introduced yet. If you go back a little bit, God placed plants in as part of people's diets for different remedial reasons. Like if you look at, say, Thailand uses a lot of lemongrass in their cooking, and lemongrass is anti-parasitic and antifungal. If you look at maybe Eastern Europe, they use a lot of garlic, and garlic is the same. If you look in Korea, they use kimchi, which will kill about anything. If you go to Japan, what did they use in their sushi? They put wasabi in. Wasabi is an antifungal, anti-parasitic. It's like God had different plants grow in different areas to help us stay well, under different conditions. Now that we have a much more global society, it's a little bit more difficult, because I might get exposed to a fungus or a parasite that the person who's working in the restaurant, who came from some other part of the world, has. And so it's not something that grows in my environment is going to protect against. So that's why you might have to take some herb that grew in India to help with your particular condition or something like that. But in general, if you look at what the different herbs that are indigenous to different societies, and you tend to use them in your cooking more, it can be somewhat preventative. That, and eating low sweets. Definitely don't get into some sexual relationship with someone. And I mean, beside doing a character vetting, which is probably most important, you also might need to do a health vetting. And it's interesting because, a lot of times when people come in, if we find something, we say, well, maybe you should bring your spouse in, so we should, or your partner or whatever, because maybe you're passing stuff back and forth. And sometimes they say, well, they won't come in. They don't want to do any of this, which to me is a sign that it's probably not the best relationship at that point. If someone's not willing to do something very simple for their, but unfortunately, that can be a reality.
Yeah, typically for my patients as well. I mean, I'd love to think that it was pretty equal, but I'd say a majority are women. They're usually the first to take more charge of their health. I guess what I've seen, but I will always tell them, if we find parasites or bacteria or something, specifically parasites and stuff and mold, I'll say your partner also needs to take these herbs with you because you're probably transferring them back and forth. Same with Lyme and all of those different types of infections. So yeah, you don't know that that could be a source of just chronic exposure as well as both partners are carrying back and forth the same things, which can be a problem. It's just very interesting how all of these things go. Now, what are some of those things that you use? Because you said when you go into a home as well, you go in and you smell and do all those things. What are some tests that you recommend for people in a home as well? Because I know there's lots of different companies and that I utilize as well. What
Well,
are some of your favorites?
I personally like immunolytics. And the reason I do is a couple of things. One is you can buy a mold plate from them for $3 and just put it out and see what grows. There are more expensive tests, like ERMI. What I don't like about them is they don't test what's living at the moment. So in other words, if you take a swab and you do it on some part of your house, it might be picking up dead mold from 5 years ago that isn't an issue anymore. So I like immunolytics because it's cheap. You can look at it yourself, or I think for $40 they'll analyze it, and you can then do some treatment. You can do diffusing of essential oils. You could use ozonation. You can do other things, and then you can always redo the test and see if it's been successful or not.
Yeah, and it's very affordable because some of those mold test companies can be very expensive as well. So it might not be applicable for everybody to do that. So I like immunolytics too. It's a great first step for a lot of people. So that's one of my favorites to use as well. Now,
And actually, what's as a practitioner, because I haven't taught this yet, you could take that immunolytics test plate and actually test it on the patient. And so you can find out what remedies are best for that particular person. So we've been using that. So we grow it on the plate, and then with kinesiology, we test it on the person. And assuming that it shows up, we can find what herbs and so forth negate the test, so we can really get a personalized program for that person.
oh yeah, that's super fascinating. I'll have to try that out. I typically just do like the urine mycotoxin test in combination with all the kinesiology testing if they're stubborn. But yeah, that's a great. Thank you for that clinical pearl. I'll try that. Now,
It's a lot of fun too. People love eating their plates.
yeah. Yeah, because you can really customize and see what exact species. Because sometimes if people's pathways are backed up, some of that urine mold testing won't be very accurate anyways, because their body's just holding on to it. So that's very
Right.
that's a great way to
And
know.
again, we're checking sensitivity a little bit more than quantity, because some people can have a lot of quantity be fine, and some people just the teeniest amount can set off some big immune response.
Yeah, totally. Mold is a huge one for immune system challenges, absolutely. Now, as we're getting close and finishing up our conversation, I love the Bible verse because you mentioned one as well in Psalm 104 that said God gave herbs for the service of man. And so he always gives us resources to be able to utilize for our service. What are some like herbs and blends that you always have on hand in your office, in your home, when you travel? What are some of those things that you always have on hand?
I like neem, which In our company, we call it Malia Supreme. It's basically neem, and neem's a great antifungal, antibacterial, antiviral. It covers almost all bases. I do like noni, which we call Morinda Supreme, and that also tends to cover all bases. So does the herb coptis, which is also called golden thread. Those are good. There are things like, if for the flu, if you use Elysium. I mean, Elysium is, I'm drawing a blank here, but star anise. And a lot of people use star anise in their food. That's where they get Tamiflu from. They get it from star anise. So a lot of times it's a good flu preventative. You know, there are herbs that have been around forever, like black walnut and elderberry and so forth, which are used for different parasites and different viruses and so forth. Again, God's provided lots of different ones, and I tend not to use blends so much, because an herb that's strong enough to kill a microbe, if it's not the right one for you, it'll make you feel ill. It might give you a headache, it might give you a stomach ache. So I tend to try to match the specific herbs that someone needs, as opposed to giving them like, here's 20 different anti-parasitic herbs thrown into one pill. I mean, if there's only one of those that's applicable for you, there's not going to be enough of it in that pill to do much. And if some of the others are strong, they might create some side effects.
Sure. Yeah, more specificity and
And if you look at nature, it's not like if an animal has some type of infection, it's like God gave it this intuitive ability to go to a plant and eat that plant, to help get it well. It's not like the animal runs all these different places and picks 50 different herbs and throws them together. It's just not how it would have happened.
Very true. Very true. Well, in closing, do you have any final tips for our listeners on what we discussed today? Or do you have anything that you'd like to leave the audience with? I know we've talked about multiple different things, correlating historical remedies and things to today. So any final closing words?
I mean, it'd be wonderful if everybody read through the Bible every year. There's an awful lot of wisdom there. I do have my book, God's Preventative Medicine, which I think is $1.99 or something like that if you have a Kindle, which has some things. There's way more than that, obviously. And I think that if you're prayerful, trust your intuition. If you're prayerful, if you're really being led to try something, because a lot of times you might know more than your doctor in certain cases, or if your doctor is a very prayerful person, or even a very scholarly educated person. There have been times where I didn't trust my doctor and I ended up in trouble too. So I think you just have to let God lead you in all of these things, and be very open that you're not being led in the wrong direction by your own desires and wants and so forth.
Yes, that's very good. Well, I will be putting all of those resources, including your book, in the bio of this podcast, and links to your amazing supplement line that you guys have developed and continue to create amazing products. And so that people can go and do that, and also your newsletter that you do, so people can stay in touch with some of the things that you're doing and success. This was such a fun podcast. I know I learned a lot. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us this morning. And for anyone listening, please share this with somebody so that they can also gain insight from what you heard today and put it together for themselves as well. So thank you again, Dr. Michael.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for all that
God
you do.
bless.
God bless you as well. And we will catch you all on the next episode.